My name is Sally Kempton. We are in my house in Carmel Valley, California. I came to the practice after having a kind of a radical awakening, which I've talked about before, but I'll tell you the full story. It was the early 1970s. I was in my 20s. I was sitting in my living room with my then boyfriend. We had just taken a psychedelic drug. I can't remember if it was acid or psilocybin, but one of those medicine plants. And we were listening to a record by the Grateful Dead. I was listening to the song "Ripple," which some of you may know. Ripple in still waters. The line that really activated me was, "If I knew the way, I would take you home." And as I was listening to those words, suddenly my awareness opened, and I recognized, I realized, I experienced that there was nothing but love. That all the complexities and the suffering and the pain and the mental stuff that I was concerned with as a downtown New York journalist just dissolved, and all I could see was love, and it was, as you can imagine, ecstatic. So I turned to my boyfriend and I said, "Oh my God, there's nothing but love." And he said, "Haven't you ever taken acid before?" So it was, I tell that story because he was somebody who'd taken acid a lot. I hadn't so much. But I knew that this was not about the drug. This was reality. And the next day, I was a writer. I was a journalist, and I had a fairly substantial contract to write a novel at the time. And I sat down at my typewriter, starting to work on my book, which was all about pain and relationships and all the difficulties between men and women. And I wrote, "What am I going to do? I was supposed to be a novelist of pain, and now I realize the truth is ecstasy." So it was a really big watershed moment, and because it was the 70s, there was no yoga scene as there is today. So I went to the 13th Street studio of Swami Satchitananda's Integral Yoga, and I began to practice with, I can't remember who the teacher was, and my experience was that I loved yoga, I took to it, but it was Shavasana that was really revelatory. So I would be in Shavasana at the end of an hour and a half class, and I would start to notice my mind and how crazy it was, and how there was this layer of peace beneath it. So very quickly my path became meditation, even though Hatha Yoga, Asana, and Tai Chi actually at a certain point were critical in my practice. The real essence of my practice has always been meditation and the confrontation with the discursive mind that occurs when we really sit for meditation. I grew up in a literary family, a left-wing humanist literary family. My father was a journalist. I grew up in the suburbs of New York in Princeton, New Jersey. I went to Sarah Lawrence College, which probably doesn't mean so much to people now, but I was very much a downtown New York kind of hipster girl. And I was fortunate enough to get a job in the early 60s working for the Village Voice, which was, in those days, really it was a hotbed of whatever was going on in the culture at the time. So the downtown art scene, Warhol, the underground film scene, the musical experiments of people like Nam June Paik and Yoko Ono in her earlier incarnation before she married Lennon. And so I covered the downtown art scene, also the rock and roll, the left-wing politics. It was a really, really great job to have when you were a 21-year-old kid. Eventually got married, went through, that whole thing for about 4 years. And in the course of my travels between New York and the West Coast, where I lived for a while, I came in contact with the nascent yoga movements. But because I was a political literary person, I always kind of looked down on it. This was kind of a California thing. I was a New York intellectual. The politics and social issues were primary. And so this experience of seeing the cover love at the heart of everything really turned my awareness around. And about 6 months after that, I found a teacher and a school. He was a Western teacher. He was South American, and he was starting what he called a Sufi school, a spiritual school. And there were, I think, 200 people in the school. We did a very intensive 3-month training, body, mind, spirit training, which included physical practice, kind of what I call brainwashing practice. In other words, working with mantras and visualizations to begin to clear off some of the layers of the discursive mind. And I plunged completely into that, receiving what I now see was a very integral education in what spiritual practice really is. You know, that it is an all bodies, all levels practice, that it involves very much looking into your own samskaras, your own, you know, your concepts and belief systems, and being present with those, as well as the effort, the tuning into the deep self, you know, the true self, the essence. And so that experience, I was with them for about 1.5 years. It really reordered my priorities in a very radical way. I became one of those people who wouldn't speak to her old friends. You know, my friends would come to see me, and I would be, you know, sitting there saying my mantra and trying to have a conversation in the, you know, in the old sort of cynical, negative way. And I just want to say that I came back to being a normal person a few years later. So I'm actually very comfortable with politics and, you know, even gossip. But it was really important for me to take that deep plunge into take no prisoners, you know, integral yoga. And I say integral not to reference the brand name Integral Yoga, but the recognition that yoga is about your entire life. And somehow, because of where my life was at the time, it felt very natural to just offer myself into the process. After about 1.5 years, I was doing with the group an extremely intense process of practice, which involved physical practice, of very, very complex visualizations based on Tibetan Buddhist Vajrayana practice. And while I was doing this, a friend took me to a workshop in Northern California with a Tibetan teacher. These were in the days when the Tibetans were just coming to this country. And he was giving a lecture. I was sitting in the front row, which was unusual for me. I'm a back of the room kind of person. And he gave an instruction, look at the back of your head. And I went, what? You know, you mean look at the inside of the back of your head, or do you want me to look at the back of my head? And he said, find out who's looking, which, as you know, is a very, very classic self-inquiry teaching. So, which I had never heard before. So I had turned inside, I asked myself, okay, who's looking? Who knows I'm having this experience? And suddenly there was a shift of consciousness. The discursive mind kind of dissolved, and I was this vast witness consciousness. And that lasted for 3 days. The thing that was really striking about it was that I was with 3 friends, one of whom was probably the meanest person I've ever met. He was one of those people who had an absolute knack for tuning into your area of vulnerability and just twisting his verbal knife into it, and it always got to me. But in that state, I could just laugh. There was, you know, I could see this is just him, this is nothing to do with me. And after that, I began having spontaneous Kundalini experiences, and I will say a little bit about what they were, because this has been very critical in my life, this dance with Kundalini. For those of you who aren't fully familiar with Kundalini, Kundalini is the evolutionary energy that's a form of the life energy, which in most people is dormant, even while the life energy is acting to make your heart beat and your eyes see and the breath come in and go out. It also works, and I'm giving you the teaching from the Tantra, it also works to keep your attention focused outward, to keep your mind thinking endlessly, and to make it very difficult to go past the thinking process. So when Kundalini in its inner form is activated, all of a sudden it becomes natural for the mind to turn inside, and the whole subtle body, the whole inner body becomes activated. So, and it starts a process which will eventually, I've been in it for years, will eventually clear out the obstructions, the karmic imprints that are lodged in your subtle body, so that you can really experience what it is to live life in clarity, to actualize that experience that I had the very first moment of my awakening of life as love. So the first kind of phase of this was that all these visualization exercises that I had been trying to do and doing very badly at. I was not a good visualizer. It was endless effort. I never saw anything. Suddenly, it was as though the inner world just woke up. You know, the deities that I was supposed to be visualizing came alive. I could see these deities in my body and lights in my body. Very interesting and exciting, as you can imagine. Huge experiences of bliss. My relationship with my then boyfriend, which had been difficult, became just a kind of ecstatic kind of mixture of love and sensuality. And then the second phase started, which is very typical of a sudden Kundalini awakening, which is that all of my buried feelings of unworthiness and anger and self-hatred and sadness started to surface. So I went through this period of just radical emotional roller coaster. And in the middle of this process, which I didn't understand at all, I realized that there had been a transmission from this teacher, but I had no idea what was happening. I became aware that a teacher from India named Swami Muktananda, who was known as a radical Kundalini master, was coming to the States, and I went to see him. Really, my reason for going to see him was to find out, whether something had gone wrong with this Kundalini rising that I had realized I was having. And when I told him my issue, he started to laugh and slap his knees. He was a very, very incredibly sort of humorous and large-souled being. And he said, "Ho, ho, ho, no, 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 it's not like that," and began to explain to me what the journey of Kundalini is really about. And long story short, I decided that he was my master, and I began to study and travel with him. And I stayed with him for 8 years until he died in 1982. I was his press secretary for a while, and I edited his books and spent a lot of time in India. And just before he died, before he took Mahasamadhi, he gave a group of people initiation into sannyasa, which is the traditional Indian monk initiation, and he gave me initiation. And I think there were 45 of us in his group that became monks. He gave me the name Swami Durgananda. And a couple of, 3 or 4 months later, he left his body. And I stayed with his organization for about 20 years with his successor, taught and, traveled, was part of the organizational teaching life, designed courses. I had what I think of as a very thorough training in texts of yoga, in the traditions of yoga. And then in 2002, decided that my spiritual growth, if I can use that word, really depended on my letting go of that whole ashram life and actually coming out into normal world and living the life that the people I was teaching lived, where you're not wearing a uniform that makes everyone respect you, where you're actually having to pay bills and take care of a household and to deal with, all the complexities of life in this world. That was in 2003. And I've been living a monkish householder life ever since, teaching mostly meditation and spiritual philosophy, and feeling just unbelievably graced by the way in which the unfolding of that love, which I glimpsed back in my painful neurotic 20s, has really become the norm of my life. Honestly, I didn't really hunt. This is the thing that I see about my life. I was drawn at after that initial moment of seeing the truth about life, actually, and it was followed by a recognition of how far I was from being able to live it. And so, in an almost desperate way, I realized that what I needed to do was literally purify the layers that kept me from experiencing that love. And for whatever reason, the next steps in my path presented themselves to me. In other words, that first group came into my life because a friend of mine had done their training. The teacher who gave me that initial awakening, I would never have gone to see on my own. A friend took me. Swami Muktananda, similarly, that he arrived in my life through meeting a friend. So it was almost as though the path unfolded itself. Even subsequently, I spent 10 years as writing a column called Wisdom for Yoga Journal, which was, actually a tremendously beautiful opportunity and allowed me to really explore the teachings of yoga and how they applied to daily life. That happened through a friend introducing me to an editor who interviewed me for a story and then asked me to write a piece. In other words, my life in yoga has really pretty much unfolded. And it's one of the ways that I believe that you're on a path that is true, is that it's almost as though you're drawn to the next thing. So even though, for instance, if I had been designing a path for myself, if I had been going to say, okay, what spiritual path fits me, as a sort of postmodern, not intellectual, but very much intellectually centered person, I would be a Buddhist because, it's non-sectarian, there's no use of the G word, and I came from a very non-religious family. How did I end up as a Hindu? It's not like me, and yet the devotional, colorful, very personal, and yet philosophically broad, the quality in Hinduism that has really one of the highest non-dual teachings in world spirituality, and yet completely has a place for personal devotion, chanting, stories. In other words, I would never have chosen that on purpose, but that was what drew me. And even the devotional quality that's very important in my spirituality, I met this teacher. He opened my heart to that experience that I had seen in the beginning. And he was a devotional person, he worshipped God as Shiva. So because I trusted him, I allowed myself to open to the idea that there actually is, a theistic quality in the world, and that somehow devotion and the feeling of love that I was seeking are married to each other. Somehow there's a very personal quality in the love of the universe that we may experience through our relationships with each other, but which we experience in a kind of meta way when we actually conceive of a personal deity, a God form, who we can be in relationship with. you know, that's a very, very radical idea for a left-wing humanist like me. You know, I was never a Catholic. I never had any connection to Western religion. So the idea of devotion as a path, of bhakti as a path, you know, completely just unfolded itself for me, as I think it does for many people in the yoga world. I would say if I've had doubts, they were doubts on the order of, because I did spend almost 30 years in, you know, in obedience, you know, in the widest sense of the word. And my doubt really was, should I have been, you know, carving out a more individualistic lifestyle for myself? Were there ways in which my psychological development was delayed by the fact that I spent so much time in a tradition in which one gave one's loyalty to a teacher? And it was an issue for me after I left the community. You know, I spent a lot of time asking myself, was that the right thing to do with the most of my life, with certainly the almost half of my life at that point. And what I came to realize actually is that, first of all, I had no choice. Honestly, the spiritual path or the path that I've been on was not something I chose. It was something I had to do. And the practice of living with a guru, in a very traditional setting, did not. I mean, both my two gurus taught me an enormous amount about many, many aspects of yoga. But more than that, they let's see, how can I say this? The absolute rigor of their commitment to the truth and to the truth of me beyond ego actually allowed me to kick and scream as my ego got, saw itself and fell down and made all the stupid mistakes that we do in life. It was somehow possible in that setting to, let's call it, purify myself of a lot of illusions, of, all kinds of things like victim consciousness, not wanting to see myself, not being able to take responsibility for my own actions in certain ways. So the training of having lived in that community was so powerful and so deep that the effects on my life as I get older, as I work with students, as I work with my own health, with the impermanence of my life, with the ups and downs that come to everybody, I realized that having lived in that rigorous tradition in which there were no excuses, you were either aligned with the divine, to use a umbrella term, or you weren't. And so I have to say, I guess that was really what my life was about. It was about learning how to align with the subtle essence of life. Not that I'm always successful at it, but I learned what it is and what it isn't. And I live here in Carmel Valley in a very rural, very beautiful, very quiet place. So I spend a lot of time doing practice. I practice for several hours in the morning, and my practice includes some asana, which not as extensive as I once did because my body's become a bit arthritic, and often a couple of hours of meditation. I chant, I putter around. I really love just sort of puttering around the physical world. So a lot of what I do is sit in nature and just be present, feel the energy of Goddess, the energy of nature around me. I call it spacing out, but I guess it's a form of meditation, and it's really a gift to be able to do that. I have some friends. They come over, we have dinner, we have long conversations. I walk on the beach, And I have these periodic travel periods where I'm in New York or I'm in San Francisco or I'm in London, you know, and everything's very kind of intense, and I see a lot of people and lead retreats, and so that's what I do. It's actually a very, let's call it monkish existence. But honestly, if I can say this straight, I'm really interested in full enlightenment, and pretty much everything I do in my life right now is subordinate to that. You know, I have no idea how much longer I'll live, but one thing I have come to realize is that if you're not really practicing for truth in this moment, that you may never get there. So that's essentially what I'm interested in, and it's the keenness of my intention is very strong sometimes. Other times more laid back, but that is my priority, and I'm pretty much putting everything else in relationship to that. So there are a lot of things I'm not doing because they feel too distracting or too, you know, too antithetical to the main really sense of purpose of this part of my life. And I think that the whole journey, the whole life my whole life has been so incredibly fortunate, so incredibly privileged in that for whatever reason I've been given the opportunity to be able to make spirituality the center of my life, to have spirituality also be my job. You know, and there are disadvantages to that because, you know, you can become a sort of professional as a teacher. And of course it's easier now in the yoga world than it ever has been. So in a way you can lose the freshness and authenticity of your intention. But if you can, you know, deal with that, to be able to have a life that's all about yoga and all about spirituality, it's just something that I'm so unbelievably grateful for, and I feel an obligation to fulfill that to the degree that is possible in this life.